This is Connected Games Research, a series of lectures from leading scholars from around the world who study digital games from a wide range of disciplinary perspectives.
I'm Dr. William Huer, and my background is in art and media history, but also in cognitive science and philosophy. So my approach to the study of games is within the humanities. And by this, I mean that I try to understand them as a relationship between individual texts and objects and their contexts. What conditions, whether technological, anthropological, economic, or otherwise, make an object, in my case, one of my lines of inquiry is about the use of games as what I call epistemic systems. That is, sets of rules and elements which make claims about the world, about the past and the future, and about the spaces of possibility that they produce. In particular, I'm interested in those games which do so in a deliberative mode, which are explicit in the models that they make legible through play. One could call this game design and play in a documentary mode. Games are unusual in their status as documentary forms, where film, television, and writing must show the world as it was or as it is, and if they don't, they will depart from their status as documentary. A historical game, or a game about the present, generally shows what could have been or what might be if one or another factor had been different, if a general or a ruler or someone else at a critical moment had made a different sort of decision. And they allow us to think of the future in the same way as a range of possibilities which depend on the choices and behaviors of many actors, human and otherwise. So, suppose that I am designing a game about the Bolivarian revolutions of South Africa, or the history of the destruction of the Inca state by the forces of the Spanish crown. In a film or play or other traditional narrative form, I would be expected to only show those events which actually occurred, for which we have a substantial record, aim, possible to exist, and legible by its audiences. How is it understood and even enjoyed by its audiences? And then how do the tastes and literacies of those audiences change over time? Also, how do they contain meaning? How do they represent things outside themselves? These I think of as the problem of the humanities, and as accordingly, the approach towards research will be very object-specific. It will derive from the particular to the universal. My work involves two families of methods, and the first is the more traditional humanistic approach, which seeks to interpret each text within the overall cultural and historical context from which it was produced. The second family of methods uses analytical techniques such as image and data analysis to understand patterns of engagement with those media forms and how these new patterns are generating new aesthetic experiences. So the work that follows today is in a historicist vein, but also from a media philosophical one. In the second half of this lecture, I'm going to illustrate how games can help us speculate about new political, social, and environmental realities. This is going to be something of an open-ended exploration of a new geopolitical model, the stack, and how it relates to the current dominant model. The dominant model for contemporary geopolitics is international relations between nation states, or the Westphalian system. We'll also be discussing how games are already informed by these new ways of thinking about geopolitics without even planning to. And we will reflect on how we can use game design to make this model clear and to understand the possibility spaces within it. And specifically, this is a response to my reading of an article by Benjamin Bratton, a philosopher of design and politics, called The Nomos of the Cloud. That article subsequently became a chapter in a book, The Stack, on software and sovereignty. Bratton posits that geopolitics now occurs within an accidental megastructure, something that has emerged on a planetary scale to create a kind of global computational system that he describes as a stack. So, if we're familiar with platform studies, that is the relationship between computational technologies, hardware, operating systems, and software ecosystems, and the content which those platforms sustains, and we're also familiar with platform economics, which are the economies of attention, distribution, and scale. Think Amazon, Alibaba, Steam, Bitcoin, eBay, Uber, Airbnb. Then Bratton is proposing something like a platform geopolitics. The stack is a structure in which each layer provides the material, context, and constituting abstractions which are available to the next layer. His model is informed by the OSI, the Open Systems Interconnection Model, a conceptual model for designing network systems, in which each layer provides an abstraction layer for interpreting and organizing the layer beneath it. Applications with which users interact depend on services in a computing session, which in turn rely on a series of protocols governing the decoding of signals in the transmission all the way down to the physical layer. For Bratton, as it was for Friedrich Kittler in his essay, Software Does Not Exist, computation is material. It is something that always happens to matter and is an abstraction of matter. It never departs from the realm of the material. Now, the stack is a planetary phenomenon. It's here and it's now. And Bratton is producing a speculative design narrative out of existing elements. His predictions come with always a maybe not, but leave us to account for the material by which he has made a sort of tentative prophecy. His stack consists of 6 levels: Earth, Cloud, City, Address, Interface, User. Each of these levels is only coherent and viable because of the levels proximate to it, and even Earth. Now, he doesn't posit the obsolescence of the nation-state as such itself. He is not saying that the nation-state is done. Instead, he's providing an anchor for these key elements of the stack, this new structure, which exists in parallel to the nation-state, and which struggles to capture or nationalize the nation-state, even as the nation-state itself responds to the structure. It has transformed how nation-states work, where their apparata are located, and how they are accessed, how surveillance functions, how services are delivered, the nature of the state of emergency by which the state demonstrates its right to exist. Now, the genealogical reduction of the modern nation-state back to the Peace of Westphalia and the cessation of the religious wars of 16th and 17th century Europe is a bit of an old song. There are elements of what we would recognize as a governmental state in a contemporary sense in earlier and non-European polities. What was established in this period of time was a convergence of spatial contiguity with other aspects of statehood: the administration of services, the creation of apparata for measuring and managing a populace, and eventually the bureaucratic production of systems for education, cultural memory, the provision of water and energy, and the construction and maintenance of infrastructure to support economic activity, like transportation networks, communication systems, and national currencies. The Westphalian polity recognized and would be recognized by others laterally. The constituent elements of nationhood created a subject consisting of subjects, national identities reimposed upon citizen subjects, local traditions inscribed into regions, and practices of time became spatial practices. Media and educational systems on a national level portrayed and stabilized these new entities. The nomos of the modern nation-state is represented comfortably by conventional cartography, a top-down map depicting bounded regions containing cities. In board games, this has a long heritage. Diplomacy, risk, Axis and allies availed themselves of the easy playability of the political map. The Clausewitzian doctrine of conflict to determine the topographic specifics was made gameable in the development of Kriegspiel. And even in games which work with dynastic logics, like the Crusader Kings series, a visual interface is dominated by a map, prioritizing bounded space over publics, privileging the contiguous space of the state over dispersed identity or migration or distributed networks as a metrics and its mechanisms of play. Now, the passage of a 4X game like Civilization is dramatically two-dimensional. A map is explored, resources belong to a territory, a settlement accesses the resources within that territory, and the networking of cities produces a region which over time become integral to that city. Proximity becomes inclusion within a boundary as technologies for monitoring mobility turn a border into a membrane. Crossing the boundary becomes contentious and the subject of conflict. Where once that conflict was about access to a resource or the integrity of a population, it is the entry into the space of the nation state that is the moment that triggers conflict and that becomes playable. The inevitable distillation of this model might be the web comic, manga, anime, Axis Powers Italia, in which a geopolitical form of moe anthropomorphism results in modern nation-states being represented by typical anime characters, with personal traits resembling less the supposed characteristics of their citizenry and more the historical temperaments of their nations as international actors. The state gets an avatar. Now, this is all pretty straightforward. We know what a political map looks like. We know the Westphalian model. It is our default understanding of geopolitics. It is eminently playable, and its playability may explain a lot of its durability in the political imagination. But it is also facing a challenge, a rival with which it must contend, and one that threatens to siphon off the functions and effects of the polities which are formed in the image of that model. Now, the stack is not the first figuration of a sequel to the nation-state. It is a well-worn genre in political writing to say that we are in the age, the post-Westphalian age. Importantly, it actually does see the nation-state as an active participant in the construction and use of the stack. Rather than saying that the nation-state is digging its own grave, it is rather there are functions involving contiguous space which remain intractable by other means. The supersession of the state in its entirety is not likely. But this has the advantage of a commitment to a rigorous materialism and a clear-eyed view of the practice of contemporary society and life within it. We start with the earth, the bottom layer, the foundation, the most material of these material layers of the stack. The earth is the basis of this computational megastructure and the site of sovereignty. The earth is within the stack to the extent that it is available for converting matter into energy and matter and energy into information, where it becomes the cloud. The earth, for Bratton, is a literal planet. It is not nature in the abstract or externalities or ground in a Heideggerian sense, but a literal, almost sphere of matter and energy which is stored and discharged upon it, that is available to be converted into other elements in the stack. From earth we come, and back to earth we will return. The earth is available to be demarcated, and this is the basis of Westphalian sovereignty. In the nomos of the earth, which is Carl Schmitt's first step in his theory of geopolitical authority, is the demarcation on the surface. But in the case of the stack, that demarcation now joins up with the provision of material which produces demarcations not on the surface. It creates networks as well as populating them with circulating goods, energy, and information. The incorporation of the Earth into the cloud accompanies, but is not coterminous with, the appearance of the Anthropocene. A crude conversion of Earth as resource is a well-worn mechanic in strategy games, real-time and otherwise, and even MOBAs. Command and Conquer, like many games, reduced all resource distraction to that of a single one, immediately convertible to computational and military power, to the acquisition of a solitary resource. In the Command and Conquer games, like shown here, that resource is Tiberium, which stands in total for the plenitude of material which is drawn from the level of the Earth. Now, this is silliness if we consider it from a simulation perspective. But what this mechanic does do is produce a local economy of activity within a stream, creating a finitude built on convertible resources. Architect, political candidate, and board game designer Alfred Wu created two games which reflect upon the Earth layer. The first of these is California Water Crisis, in which different bioregional stakeholders, different parts of the state of California, struggle to produce a water policy that they can live with. Wu's games often feature cooperation within the context of competition. There are universal lose conditions which no player wants, but they often happen anyway as players eke out what advantage they can to accomplish their own win conditions. Even more relevant is his Geoengineering 101, set in a very near future in which climate change mitigation efforts have mostly failed, and players produce a series of technological fixes to the crisis. Non-local effects of these interventions produce a patchwork quilt of shifts in temperature and rainfall. Regions can become unlivable if either temperature or rainfall exceeds a certain bound. There is an unanchored entity called the global elite in this game, which does not have an unlivability condition, reflecting the asymmetry of the experience with climate change. But all mitigations produce hardships, which is the unhappy currency of the game. The goal is to lose the least without triggering the universal lose condition, which is the creation of an unlivable planet. The cloud is the collective and theoretical computational potential of the Earth at any given time. It is conceptually the easiest piece to understand in the stack. It is easiest to see how the cloud emerges from Earth as an alternative from the emergence of the geopolitical structures of the nation state, which have also emerged from the Earth. And it is where the clearest alternative to Westphalian polities lie. The cloud is the home of Facebook, of Apple, of Tencent, of Amazon, and especially of Google. One visual representation of the reframing of the Earth by the cloud is this website, which maps the undersea cables which produce the global internet. Each of these linkages is described here as a complex sequence of public-private partnerships, negotiations between sovereign states over territoriality and extraterritoriality, and is premised on existing and possible accelerations of informatic and economic activity between these entities. Each cable has its own story, and the cloud is a target of the state's anxiety about sovereignty. Confronted with the GDPR, the new data protection and privacy regime of the European Union, Facebook moved its users' putative data home back to North America. Mark Zuckerberg ignored the summons of a flummoxed British Parliament, a body incredulous about the declining significance of the vestigial phallocracy in the wake of its atavistic gesture to sovereignty and taking back control, even as Google builds up its new data and research center in the middle of London. The city sits upon the cloud not as a nervous system of a state, but in terms of the stack, it is the point where the cloud aggregates things and distributes them. The internet does not enter into a nation state. It enters into a hub, a city. And so it is this aggregator of infrastructure by which services are delivered to publics. It acts as an informatic entity and produces informatic effects. It is a city that is the site of the material practice of routing between addressable components. So city sims are as much about optimal paths for routing and directing cloud-driven resources as they are about the old questions of taxation and infrastructure. These are the playable entities in Alfred Tu's Geoengineering 101. They are classes of cities which share circumstances. An event in the Earth will have effects on island cities distributed globally that they will not have on the global elite. Port cities have their own conditions and act and respond accordingly with patterns of policy that are different from those of inland cities. Tu also designed within the city frame in his game Bay Area Regional Planner, in which contesting agenda, the preservation of historical urbanisms, the reduction of commute times, land conservation, and economic development are held in secret by players who propose policies to advance these hidden agendas. There is still, again, a universal lose condition, which is wide-scale unaffordability for average families, a lose condition which is often reached. The city sim seldom participates in stack thinking because it is too often a simple exercise in tech trees. Contemporary urbanism sees the city as an interface to services and activity, as a system for generating certain effects and forestalling others. To function, the elements of the city need to be addressable. Addressability is the feature by which an object within the stack can be acted upon, by which it can be located and addressed. While it can refer literally to the addressability of things, it can invoke the idea of the Internet of Things. It also includes phone directories, identity numbers, street addresses, credit scores, inventory records, trace shipments, markers in Google Maps, and so forth. The subject of contemporary stack politics is already addressable in multiple regimes. A Fitbit addresses a user's vital signs, not the user's subjectivity. Revenue collecting bodies like the HMRC in the UK or the IRS in the United States address a range of taxable entities, individuals, but also households, businesses, and properties. Bratton speculates on the design and geopolitical implication of a level of addressability in IP version 6, the proposed replacement for the addressing scheme of the Internet. IPv6 provides enough addresses to allow each of us to address and singularly tag each cell in each of our bodies. The fantasy of the hackable city, which informs games like Watch Dogs and Quadrilateral Cowboy, are a symptom of conventional addressability, but its geopolitics are relatively unexplored by games. Social platforms make possible an address to groups of shared affect and aesthetics. Cat owners who like frisbees, the color green, and coffee can be treated as an addressable unit by those who pay Facebook for the privilege to do so. Electoral politics within the stack are about refinements of addressability at the expense of the sense of the public as a body politic. This was evidenced in the Brexit campaign's use of data to create a new political entity, the Leave voter, through the analysis of their sentiments revealed in their social media activity. Interface is not just screen. Interface is a mechanism by which users access the rest of the stack. An intersection between the nation state and the stack is the border, and the history of the border is a shadow of the history of the stack. Computationality has transformed the border dramatically. Bratton observes that the border was once a literal geospecific entity, policed by walls and concentrated at ports, roads, and guard posts. Now, a border is largely a geopolitical entity, largely a virtual entity, often deep within the territory of the state. An airport is both a border and an interface to a spatial address. Interfaces are bidirectional. They allow the stack to access users as well as in inverse. Papers, Please is about the border as a user interface and the user interface as a border. If the address is how the user or other entity is located, the interface is a mechanism by which the user acts or is acted upon. The nation-state creates a different public than the platform does. The citizen receives services as part of a reciprocal relationship of obligation to a polity, which it both constitutes, in collective with other citizens, and inhabits and sustains through taxation, economic activity, and political participation. A user is a different entity. And Paper, Please is, again, as much about the user as it is about the interface. It's about the border guard whom the player plays and the non-player characters who seek to cross the border for one reason or another. The user is a dramatic departure from the citizen. If Foucault described modernity as a transition from sovereignty to governmentality, from a population coming with territory to the population as constituting the proper object of the state's activity within that territory, the liberal subject, the citizen consumer, the user of public services is, among other things, the displacement of the citizen by a consumer, who in theory could go elsewhere. But that isn't completely correct either. Bratton emphasizes that not all users are human. A user of a stack needs only be able to know, have, and be, the last referring as much to addressability as to raw existence. Corporations and other legal entities are users. Software agents and non-player characters are users. Animals are users, from cats playing with iPads to dogs using internet-connected, camera-equipped remote feeding trays. Hannah Wehrman and Michelle Westerlaken have been pursuing research on game design for animals, unwittingly perhaps bringing them into the user level of the stack. The user is historically the default subject position for games and other applications. So this brings me to the final segment of the talk. How can we use this change in understanding of geopolitical structures to make new games? And or use games to make these shifts understandable to players and audiences. To that end, I have a set of principles, a kind of discipline for design. Games, for my purposes here, are conceptual forms. They are computational and thus uniquely suited for making legible the features of this emergent accidental megastructure. We should consider a geopolitics without Westphalian topographies, to consider games with multiple geopolitical actors without using conventional cartographic imagination. What entities have a gameable agency and work on a global scale that could be the elements of game design? A geopolitics without Westphalian entities, in which each player takes a position as an entity which does not correspond to a nation state, yet has the ability to act within a stack structure. There is also a bonus if there can be asymmetry in design. One player is a corporation, but the other a programming language. One is a religion, the other a non-human species. So this brings me to the end of my talk, and it is also the model of my approach, letting games work as toolkits for thinking. I hope you find it interesting and useful, and I invite you to contact me if you have any questions or follow-up. Thank you. The relationship between historical and speculative thinking involves how they both work with the questions of the necessary and the contingent. The events of the past seem inevitable, available for explanation, but the future seems to remain within the space of the contingent. The implementation of a game figures some things as inevitable, others as random, and others as a matter of the decision of the player. Thus is there the relationship between the necessary and the contingent in history. That which is inevitable given a range of base conditions, which is the necessary, whenever you have a certain situation, something must occur, versus that which is dependable on unpredictable and indeterminate or random elements. I'm not addressing this to you as a philosopher of history, but more from a media philosophical perspective. This is a question of how histories are represented, the problem of media, rather than a question of how the past is represented. So imagine that we've been asked to produce a game about Brexit. It seems to be one of those events that was amenable to modeling. There were a fairly discrete set of possible outcomes and consequences with a number of things that could have been graded as win-loss conditions. But you already have some challenges from the outset about the constraints of your game design. Where do you start the game? Do you start at that point that the Liberal Democrats decide to go into a coalition with the Conservatives, at the point in which David Cameron puts a referendum on EU membership onto the Conservative Party manifesto, on the run-up to the referendum, on the day after? In each of these cases, the game would start with certain conditions in place. Most of the conditions, we imagine, would correspond with historical events as we understand them. Perhaps there might be some variant which presumes that the UK had become a republic or that Scotland had already become independent, but we would think of these as relatively unhelpful for thinking about Brexit. Up to the point that we want to start to ask questions, we stick with the necessary. Just as a game that explored the dynamics of the Cold War that was predicated on a German victory in the Second World War would have been unhelpful to thinking about subsequent US-Soviet relations. So what then is inevitable and what is up for play? This is a question that does more than give us the parameters of the play experience. It contributes to us forming an understanding of what it means to participate in a society's policies. Up to the moment of the game, history is given. There's a range of design possibilities and scenarios involved from this point. Does one make levels of immigration fixed or variable? Are they contingent on Home Office policies, on economic circumstances, or on continental politics? Are events like the assassination of Joe Cox inevitable? Or is there a random element involved? Do they occur under certain conditions? It is helpful to transpose our thinking about contemporary processes when considering how the agency of different figures in historical games are framed. When we think about the contemporary context, we tend to have more flexible ontologies than we often apply to our thinking in the past. It's easier to make history contingent on the activities of those with a direct hand on the apparata of state and arms. Or another way to frame the question of the contingent is, who is to blame? For things which are unfolding, they don't feel inevitable. We could imagine ourselves dealing with Brexit and choosing to follow one policy or another as a member of parliament, or as a business owner choosing whether or not to relocate a business or close a factory. There are things which are contingent on human choices and activities at a recognizable scale. Just as it is now, so must have been 2 weeks ago, 2 years ago, 2 decades ago. The consequences of assuming necessity or inevitability are serious. In an article by Thomas Andrews and Flanner Burke, they proposed the 5 C's of historical thinking, the concepts of change over time, causality, context, complexity, and contingency. Their standards assert that students should challenge arguments of historical inevitability by formulating examples of historical contingency, of how different choices could have led to different consequences. These standards also remind us that discrete historical skills are interactive and mutually supportive and cannot be taught in the absence of a particular historical content. They also see this as important for civic participation. So the above quote is from the Standards for Historical Education published in 2007, that it is a trap to think of the way things have unfolded inevitably, that the way things are is the way they had to be, and that humankind lacks free will and the capacity for making choices. Unless students can conceive that history could have turned out differently, they may unconsciously accept the notion that the future is also inevitable or predetermined, and that human agency and individual action count for nothing. No attitude is more likely to feed civic apathy, cynicism, and resignation, precisely what we hope the study of history will fend off. An example of the tension between a rhetoric of necessity and one of contingency is described in an after-action report, Inca, Rise of the Condor, discussed by Thomas Apperley in his own article about counterfactuals in history, to which my research is strongly indebted. An after-action report is a document created by people who have played a strategic level historical game in which they document the choices they made and the results as if it were history. Rise of the Condor is a deep description of a campaign to maintain the Incan state in Peru in the wake of the European invasion of the Americas for as long as possible, and the machinations that were required to make that work. The model by which such a state can endure the onslaught of the Spanish and Portuguese invaders with the technologies of war and statecraft that they brought to bear is such that it requires masterful maneuvering and a little bit of luck. Even so, eventually, the cautiously navigated state falls to the British by the 19th century. The sense emerges that the total triumph of European civilization in the Americas was inevitable, necessary, given the ongoing and profound differential in technologies and access to resources. But this is implicit on what the game makes actionable. What is not made actionable, for example, is a shift in the dynamics of recognition. Perhaps it is the case that the fall of the pre-Columbian civilizations to the European ones was fairly inevitable given the ethos and mandates of the later and the techniques available to them. Ultimately, only one world is truly possible, the one that we experience up to this moment. Yet the counterfactuals chosen are still selective. The possibility of, for example, reverse religious conversion, of the conversion of the Spanish invaders to Incan religious ideas, was left unexplored. It may not be enough to simply mourn the past, but instead, better to understand what forces might have made it different than it was, and to take this perspective to counter what is called capitalist realism, the fact that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine different ways of living.